I'm Benjamin Hall, and I'm searching for heroes. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Searching for Heroes, and thank you as ever for joining me today. Today's the first time that we are moving from one theme to another. About 4 weeks ago on this podcast, we decided to start looking at themes over the course of 4 episodes and 4 guests so that we could really dig in to different ideas and hear different sides of them. And today is the day that we are moving from the last theme, which was solitude, which was fascinating, to a new theme, which is forgiveness. And so today I wanted to talk to you briefly just about my own thoughts on solitude briefly, on what we learned, and also talk about forgiveness, which is the theme that we're moving into now. So first of all, when I talk about solitude, I think first and foremost, what I learned is that solitude is often misunderstood. It is so often confused with loneliness, or it's treated like something to be avoided. But I think, as we heard from our guests, solitude isn't just the absence of others. It is a space. It's a space that can be painful. It can be powerful. It's a space where you can be transformed. But that is all depending on how we face it. And I think that is so interesting because since I began this podcast, anything difficult, anything traumatic, the way we deal with it depends on how we face it. If we stand up to it, if we open our arms to it, if we see difficult moments as places that we can learn from. And solitude is exactly the same. We spoke to Dr. Nguyen, for example. She's a leading researcher on solitude. And I remember she told us that being alone intentionally offers clarity, offers restoration. But when it is imposed on us, and especially on the elderly or the isolated, it really can wound. And so her insight really set the stage for everything that followed. How do we stop it wounding us? How can we make it beneficial? We spoke also to Stephen Callahan. Remember, he survived 76 days alone in a life raft in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean after shipwreck. And I think he showed us that solitude, he showed it to us at its most extreme. And he described how discipline, wonder, routine helped him endure the Atlantic's vast, vast silence, finding purpose not just in survival, but in observation. And he found, when he had no one to talk to, that he talked to the stars in the sky and the fish in the sea, and he found a way of finding company. We spoke to Chris Fagan. She trekked unsupported to the South Pole with her husband, the first couple to do so. And she spoke about how that solitude stripped everything away from her. There was no noise, no distraction. It was just the landscape and herself. And she said that she discovered everything while she was alone in the middle of the Antarctic. She discovered fear, joy, and resilience in equal measure. And I think one of the things I really learned is that in solitude, you mustn't hide from things. So much of our lives is spent trying to hide and not really examine and dig deep and think about the tough moments. Well, she managed to do it by spending weeks alone. And I think that we can do it in shorter periods as well, taking a moment just to be alone, to think deeply. And then finally, we spoke to Howard Axelrod, and he spent 2 years completely alone in the Vermont woods after he lost vision in one eye. His story wasn't about escape. It was about relearning how to see, how to live, how to be present. So again, for him, that solitude was both, I suppose it was confrontational at some point, and it was difficult at moments, but it was also really, really healing. Now, I think what I found really powerful was how each person encountered solitude differently. For some, it was physical, for some, it was emotional, and for quite a few of them, it was spiritual. And I kept thinking through all of it that in solitude, that's the moment we meet ourselves in our rawest form. And for some people, maybe even you listening, that is terrifying. But it is, as I said, transformative. And look, I've reflected on my own experience. I started this podcast because of what I went through in Ukraine and my injuries. And after that attack, in many senses, I went through a kind of forced solitude myself. I spent months and months, often alone in hospitals. I say alone in the sense that I was taken away from everything I knew. And I was just there alone in my own head for hours and hours a day thinking. And that was painful at times. But it was also where I found parts of myself that I never knew existed. Strength, patience, and also perspective. And so I think, summing it up, that's what the theme of solitude reminded me, that solitude is not an enemy. It's a teacher. It can be a harsh one, but it is a teacher nonetheless. So thank you to all our guests. Thank you to all of you who've listened, all of you who shared your stories, those who sat with us in these quiet moments. But next and now we move on to a new theme, which is forgiveness. And look, it's another idea that tests our limits. It is something that reveals our character. And so over the next 4 episodes, we're turning to this theme that lies at the very heart of resilience. It's difficult, it's divisive, it's very human, and it's also profoundly healing. Or, as one of our guests says, sometimes it's the opposite of healing. Sometimes it makes things worse. Forgiveness. It is a word that we hear often. It's in our religions, it's in our families, it's in our politics, justice systems, it's in relationships. We grow up being told to forgive. Sometimes we are praised for it, and other times we're criticized for forgiving too easily, or not at all. So I think we're really going to be looking at what forgiveness really means. Is forgiveness about letting go of pain? Or is it letting someone else off the hook? Does it mean you don't hold someone to account? Is it a weakness? Is it a strength? What happens when forgiveness feels impossible? So we're going to be exploring all of that over the coming episodes, and we're going to do it in the same way that we always do on this podcast, by speaking with people who've lived through the unthinkable, people whose strength comes not from avoiding hardship, but walking straight through it. One of my guests will be Azim Khamisa, and his story still stops me in my tracks. Azim's son, Tarek, was just 20 years old when he was shot and killed by a 14-year-old gang member. But instead of choosing revenge, Azim chose to forgive and to transform his grief into purpose. He went and founded a foundation with the grandfather of his son's killer. And together they now speak to young people about peace, about cycles of violence, and about the power of second chances. I'll also be joined by Amanda Gregory. She's a psychotherapist who challenges the idea that forgiveness is always necessary for healing. And in fact, she argues that for many trauma survivors, being told to forgive can feel like another form of harm. And she's right to ask, who benefits when forgiveness is demanded? Does forgiveness sometimes serve society more than it serves the victim? So we'll talk about that too. Because I think while we often celebrate forgiveness as a virtue, we don't always talk about how complicated it can be. Forgiveness, for example, it doesn't erase pain, not as far as I'm aware. It does not restore what has been lost, doesn't feel like it brings peace. Well, not always. And for some, I think the pressure to forgive, the pressure to be noble, to move on, can feel like a betrayal of what they have endured. And look, again, I was drawn to this theme partly because of my own journey. After what happened in Ukraine, after those injuries, an experience that changed my life, that tested me, I look back and I don't forgive the Russians who fired on our car that day, who killed my colleagues, Pierre and Sasha, and the 2 Ukrainians who were with us. But at the same time, I'm not angry. I'm not looking for revenge. And so, for me, at least, that space right there, where justice, pain, and peace intersect, I guess where that theme lives. More of our conversation right after this. I remember in one of my earlier interviews on this podcast, it must be a year ago or so, I spoke with Diane Foley. She's the mother of the journalist Jim Foley, who was kidnapped and murdered by ISIS. Diane met with one of her son's killers, one of these jihadis who had been arrested. He was taken to the US. And amazingly, somehow, through the darkness, she found a way to forgive. And I remember that conversation vividly. I remember how Diane described forgiveness not as absolution, but as liberation. She forgave not to let someone else go free. She forgave to unshackle herself, to stop carrying the weight of hate. So it's stories like hers and like Azim's and Amanda's and so many others that show us forgiveness is not simple. It's not linear. It's definitely not beautiful. But when it comes from a place of honesty, it does and can change lives. And we'll look at how forgiveness is shaped by culture, because look, it doesn't mean the same thing everywhere. In South Africa, after apartheid, forgiveness became a tool of national healing. The country encouraged victims to publicly forgive in exchange for truth, not to forget, but to move forward. In Japan, very different. Forgiveness is very private. It's inward. It's shaped by centuries-old values like honor and emotional restraint, less about confrontation. It's about harmony. And then if you look at indigenous cultures like the Maori in New Zealand, forgiveness takes the form of restorative justice. It's a process formed on reconciliation and restoring balance rather than punishment. So there, it's not about erasing the wrong. It's about repairing relationships. And we're going to look also and talk to some guests about how religion sees forgiveness. Because look, every faith calls us towards it. In Christianity, it is a sacred command. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. The story of Jesus forgiving his executioners is held up as the highest moral ideal. In Islam, forgiveness is spiritual, it's personal. In fact, one of the names of Allah means forgiving. And yet at the same time, in Islam, the Quran talks about jihad, waging war against those who don't believe in you. So the contradiction there is interesting to me. In Buddhism, of course, forgiveness is not about right or wrong. It's about peace of mind. It might not be necessary for the other person, but it brings peace. And when I think of forgiveness and talk about it, there are the people, the ones we'll hear from, who have forgiven the unforgivable, like Azim. There are those who I may not be speaking to, I hope to speak to. One well-known example, for example, is Eva Kor. She's a Holocaust survivor who publicly forgave the Nazi doctors who experiment on her. She said she forgave not for their sake, but to free herself from hatred. And I think others, survivors of genocide, violent crime, they often speak powerfully about choosing not to forgive and finding peace through truth, justice, or just, I think, remembering. So I guess those are the questions we'll be asking. For example, what do we owe to those who have harmed us? Do we owe them anything at all? What does it mean to forgive someone who doesn't ask for it? Can there be justice without forgiveness? And how do we live with the pain when forgiveness just doesn't come? So I think this isn't going to be an easy conversation, but I think it might be one of the most important ones that we've had yet, because I think forgiveness really does live in all of us. It's in the way we remember. I think thinking about it is important in the way we move forward. Whether or not you embrace it or not, it's important to think about it. So, look, I hope you're going to join me over the next few episodes as we talk about forgiveness. And as I always say, take a minute both to think about solitude and to try and think about yourselves and think about forgiveness. I'm sure each and every one of you has someone they think should forgive them, and the other way around, someone that they feel they should forgive to. And have a moment to think about those, and join me next week for our first guest on forgiveness. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening to Searching for Heroes. Listen ad-free with a Fox News Podcasts Plus subscription on Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Prime members can listen to this show ad-free on the Amazon Music app.